We will, all right, so we will call to order at 8:05 p.m. And would somebody like to read the commission's land acknowledgement? I'll go ahead and do it. We'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of a rich and diverse group of Native peoples who have called this area home for more than 10,000 years. We honor, with gratitude, the land itself and the descendants of these Native peoples who are still here today. All right, we all have a draft agenda. Is there any objection to the proposed agenda, or else we'd entertain a motion to approve?
So moved.
So moved. Second, without objection, the agenda is approved. Next, we have approval of the meeting minutes. So the board packs had the draft minutes from the December 9th regular meeting. Were there any proposed edits to the minutes?
Staff has one. Planning commissioners absent. Arthur Latchman is not a planning commissioner.
That's what I was asking. Did we have somebody appointed that I wasn't aware of?
No.
That was what
that would be one correction. He was an attendee from the public.
That makes sense. All right.
Yeah.
Any other edits to the minutes? I'd entertain a motion to approve.
Move to approve minutes.
Moved, seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
It's unanimous. All right. Next, we have meeting dates. Are there any concerns with our next regularly scheduled meeting date? And I know we have for old business kind of revisiting meeting frequency.
There are not, oddly enough, compared to last year's. We did the draft every other Tuesday, 7 p.m. Meetings, and there are no conflicts, vacations, holidays.
Terrific.
City Hall closed, and so it's essentially second Tuesday, 7 p.m. all month long.
Sounds great.
Or
Is anybody on the commission aware that they might be needing to miss it for some reason? Seeing head nods. So,
I think I'll be missing that one, Sam. I'm out of town.
okay. Okay, we might have one or two absences. Seems like we might still have a quorum then. All right. So next we have public hearings. We have none, but we might have public comments.
Hi. First, I want to say it's amazing just to be at this meeting and hear everything that you guys have to do. Or as hopefully Maddie said, you can narrow it down and really get some things done. So we're part of a larger group, which is a community land trust grouping of community members. And we've been in existence for over 5 years. We started with Ann Stadler, in fact. Sally Yamasaki, I'm sorry, I'm going to do that. Sally Yamasaki, Michael Troyer, and Donna Hockey. And we too have been looking for a long time and educating community about community land trusts. And this year we want to really focus on specific things. Let's see. Some of the things that we've heard from the community over the 5 years is the obvious one. Of course, we want a Main Street LFP. You know, can't we buy the professional building and make a place that's ours, not a shopping center owned by someone from New York? Because that's there. That's a huge one that the community, I don't know anybody who wouldn't wish for that. The other thing, though, is also the notion of cottage housing, that we can do something where we have, be able to have housing that still can give community land trusts as well as market rate people the ability to buy smaller housing and form a community within a community. So I think some of Donna and Michael might talk more about some of these things, right? Okay.
I just wanted to, hi, my name's Donna. I just wanted to remind us too about the history of Lake Forest Park, and that we often think of our branding as just the trees and nature, which is of course very important. But we also were founded on the idea that Lake Forest Park wasn't just for rich people, it's for everybody. And it was the property was divided that way in smaller increments, so that's why we have the sweet cottages and the ramblers and then the mansions. And we really are afraid that we're going to lose that fabric and feel, that is our culture. It's in our DNA to have that kind of diversity, particularly of incomes. We all know the problem, but we also know that, we get back to our history. And of course, we always want to honor the first people as well. And like Sally was saying, we've been concentrating on community land trusts for a while, but we're also have broadened ourselves to any type of housing that can help. So, and like Maddie said, innovation is the key when it comes to things right now. So thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me here today. Michael Troyer. So as my colleagues have said, we're kind of keen on this idea of finding space in our city where these pieces of land can be held in trust and provide this affordable option. It's interesting to hear you talk about small A affordable housing where you scale it just so that you could have a traditional starter home. But we also realize that our landscape is complex, and having this detailed information about critical areas, especially as you're updating the critical areas plan, is helpful to us continue to inform about land trusts as a way to create affordable housing and get something like cottage housing in place where it serves multiple purposes in the same area. So you'll be hearing us regularly come back to you and help give you a community response about what everybody is looking for. We've run programs like that where we drew 100 people in this room at one point in time. So we thank you for your work and for the opportunity to talk to you.
Can I just end with, so we're just community. We don't understand all the things that you guys were talking about, or obviously Mark knows so much about, but we want to make these things happen. We're getting closer to a potential maybe property that we have, but we don't know what we can do because we need more than, let's say, if it's a half acre. My understanding is that maybe we can get 3 cottage housing, housing units on there, but would need to have more to make it a place where we could have that, the community land trust as well as market rate housing together. Because the difference is you can have, not that I'm saying anything negative about ADUs or DADUs, but the difference is this will build equity to families and build generational wealth where other places that only rent does not provide. So I hope there's some way we can continue to think about whatever we do, whether it's some dream of, Mark, down at the town center, where are we? We're over that way, Main Street. If we have a building that's not too high for our community, but that a portion of it can be community land trusts in flats. They do exist. We work along Homestead. And if any of you want to have tours or anything more education with regarding community land trusts, we're here. We'd be happy to take you and introduce you to it.
Yeah. It is the only thing that's going to remain affordable in the future. So that's why we're so big on that concept and trying to integrate it somehow. But we know it's not the full answer, but we certainly know that it's a strong answer. So for future affordability. So.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. I know for the commission, we did hear from Homestead Community Land Trust about 3 years ago. It was March. Sally, you came with the group. And I know that has stuck with me in the back of my mind as one of the kind of aspects I'd like the group to explore as part of that affordability discussion. Is there contact information you can share or something you can share with me or with Mark that if any of us want to follow up, we can get some more information?
We can leave you with our information, or you can contact Mark and maybe I can give you but I will leave our.
That would be great.
And then Sam too, if you guys want, maybe we could even arrange with Kathleen a tour like that. That's just, we maybe the Benny Ridge talk, depending on how far it is, because that's a place where they have mixed land trust and market rate.
Yeah, terrific.
Stack flats.
Thank you so much, Sally. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Yes, and if anybody, you know of anybody who wants to apply, we have the 2 vacancies, so. All right, so next we had report from City Council liaison. I suppose we just had kind of a report.
Yeah, I think so.
The discussion or assignment of new liaisons and appointments and who representation across the board happened last week at City Council. There are 2 candidates that would very much like to be the Planning Commission liaison. So there's 1 category that's not decided as yet. So at the next meeting, I'll take that up. So there's no appointed liaison to replace John Lebo at this moment.
Terrific.
How does it decide? Does it?
That I don't know. Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's decided very friendly is how I would carry it. But not being in the room, I don't know how it progresses to having an appointed liaison.
Terrific.
But I have faith it will happen.
Sharing the load.
No doubt. All right, so next we're on to old business, and I think there's 2 items we have. One is the continuation of the discussion we had in the joint meeting just moments ago on what is our 2026 work plan, and then the second item is going to be our meeting frequency discussion. So maybe we could start by opening it up to talk about the work plan discussion. We heard a lot of input from City Council members. We had a lot of good discussion about potential items to focus on. We had our discussion at the last meeting. So I don't know if coming out of that, it makes sense to kind of go around the room and hear from everybody. Like, would we like to focus on those things we talked about last month, the required items? We heard a perspective from a council member or 2, or the mayor and maybe another council member, that maybe there should be more of a focus on future looking things. So it might be good to kind of get a sense of the commission of, you know, where are we at after this discussion? Are there any items that emerge or rise to the top that we think we'd like to focus on? Are there any other comments coming out of that conversation? I think I'd like to hear from everybody on that. Yanni?
Yeah, I'll chime in with maybe a question for Mark. I mean, I know we talked about some of the deadlines around those mandatory items a little bit. But I don't know, and like in this particular round of updates, like what is the lift, right? Like how big are these? Back when I was a consultant, I worked for cities that were doing the big updates to their CAOs, and it was a huge lift. There were mandates to update your best available science that you're using and all that. And I guess I'm asking you, like I'm having trouble kind of imagining, are these huge or cleanup or something in between with the CAO and the SMP in particular?
We have new information. So I'll summarize it as we have a 2-year plan. The question's always asked, when was the deadline? What's the penalty? There is no penalty. There's no, I'll use my words carefully. There's no likely or tangible penalty. Do we have to do this? Absolutely. So we'll take them one at a time. Critical areas ordinance, as you know, 3 years of legislation, middle housing, adding a lot to every city's plate. But tagged on with that conversation always was, oh yes, and by the way, don't forget you need to update your critical areas ordinance. Big cities had multiple staffs, they did it. Some cities couldn't do it, small cities could not. We were lucky we did the mandates, comprehensive plan periodic update, and then a climate element 4 years early, and then middle housing development code, sign ordinance. So it was a heavy lift for a city this size and a staff this size. So was there a deadline? Yes. December, when we were supposed to adopt the periodic plan. Next question is always, what's the penalty? There isn't one. If you force staff to be an attorney, eventually there is one. You know, if you have an item that goes to growth management hearings board, or, you know, we don't have a lot of development here, so there's no likely penalty. If we pursue that diligently, there's a benefit to it. As far as, is it a heavy lift? It's heavier than having just staff do it. Even if we were afforded time and range and scope to just dive in and learn it, learn from other examples, it rises to the level of a consultant for sure because of the expertise. it's a matter of opinion as far as to what degree. We have a very strong critical areas ordinance. This is not a policy shift. This is not a relook at what we just did at comp plan level. That's solid. But to the extent that you need the expertise and learn it about best available science, it's those legislative or fish and wildlife requirements that are complicated to a layperson, complicated to me, but a consultant could be brought in at the city's expense to do that expertise. Staff is well versed on the public outreach, could certainly sit in and understand the language that they're using, adapt it to code, create the ordinances, do the public hearings, explain it to city council. But the lift is the consultant that understands what cities are going through for, let's say, the last 5, maybe 8 years of legislation. How has the field progressed? Best available science is the best description, but then everyone says, what is that? So it's a continuation of what we're doing, but in a slightly more complicated, detailed way, more analysis, less reliance, I would say, on a fixed number of buffer that does the job. Whereas our code is 115-foot buffer, you're good to go. And a setback. This is more nuanced to fit the type of habitat, much more science, but it can be adapted to code, put into our municipal code and understood. So I would go with the in-between mixed hybrid. You need a consultant for the expertise. Now, the advantage is that applies citywide, everywhere but the shoreline. And the shoreline has critical areas in the appendix and so forth and adopts them. And they can't just be a word for word, hey, go see our critical areas ordinance. It's the same. But if we look at this as a 2-year effort and we nail the critical area ordinance update, that becomes the basis for the critical area chapter appendice in the SMP. So that's a 2-for-1. Timing, same issue. Now I'll move on to the Shoreline Master Program. The city started that effort. The deadline was in 2019. We've had conversations with ecology staff specific to shoreline saying, ignore it. Is there a penalty? Yes. Does it matter? No. We're not going to get there. If you shun them and ignore this and say we're not going to have one, yeah, it's bad. But that's not what we're saying. We just need more time and bandwidth. What they represented is if you're working diligently, there is nothing ecology is going to say that you're out of compliance, right? Eventually, you may not be eligible for a grant. Eventually, you may not get a favorable ruling at the Shoreline Hearings Board. But that's not what we're facing right now. So yes, there's a penalty, but it's not soon. The next deadline is 2027. Their take, and they agree with staff, is why don't you focus on that? What it relies on is that they're doing rulemaking changes this year. I sit on that panel just to absorb and learn, not by any means to advise them. But I become aware, and since they're examining rulemaking and they know which categories they're focusing on, they would like to wait because the grant cycle is paused, but it's likely after the grant or after the rulemaking, the grant cycle reopens. And if the city takes advantage of that, having already done the critical areas science, then we're well placed to apply for a grant through Ecology or Commerce, update our Shoreline Master Program with a consultant, and meet the 2027 deadline, the next deadline, next round.
Would it be the same consultant or different consultants?
That's hard to say. What I would offer is the agreement, contract, and the draft work done for the SMP up till COVID can be used for a future, but that we'll have to RFQ to be competitive. When we do that for linearly for both these efforts, it's likely that firms that have the expertise to do both would apply. Mm-hmm. But if the plan is let's do critical areas ordinance and we frame the budget and we start that this year, the RFQ would be for critical areas ordinance. It wouldn't be a package deal. Okay. But it very well could be the exact same firm that is successful in both efforts. but wouldn't be determined till we get a grant.
Yeah.
Now, worst case, we wouldn't get a grant or the grants disappear. We'd still have to do this. So but that would be a next year problem.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm thinking about more as time for us, thinking, is this a third of the year or, what is this? And obviously I understand the consultant part of it. We could probably get a consultant on board if the city's able to do that. And maybe we let them work on stuff for a while. We work on some other things until they have something for us to look at, and then we tackle this. So as opposed to saying, well, let's do this right out of the gate in 2026. Let's get some information developed and, get a better feel for what it is we're going to be wrestling with, and then tackle that when we have something to look at. But yes, it did answer my question. I wasn't sure if this was a really light touch update or a major redo, and it sounds like it's in between.
David, what do you think? I'm just going around the room.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. So reflecting on the conversation with the city council, I in all honesty, I didn't hear anything surprising. And I didn't hear a whole lot of direction either. I heard ideas, kind of big general ideas, other than the economic center kind of activity. I think that's it sounds like there's an emphasis. It's like somehow for us to explore that in one way or another, although they didn't give us any direction to do so. I think going back to what you just presented, Mark, I think that this critical, I think this would be very useful for us. I mean, it's something that you've brought to us. It sounds like it's not critical, this critical ordinance, but it's
not as urgent.
It's not as urgent, but I do think it'd be a very interesting, for me, it'd be a very interesting exploration, learning opportunity. And I think it'd be valuable for the city.
And to mirror, not to interrupt the flow and open-mindedness, but to mirror Yanni's comments, if this were a priority, it's as simple as I sit with finance, get a snapshot of my existing budget that informs the request to council. Can I do an RFQ? It informs the fiscal. How are we going to pay for it? I think that the remaining line item is there. That's my first step. If it is, it becomes simpler. We explain the need. Here's the funding. Let's do it. I do the RFQ. That provides time for absorbing what is critical areas or whatever you need to prepare for the consultant. And then they come in with their scope and do it. So it wouldn't be immediate. It'd be immediate for staff. But it would be a year-long effort for commission.
So one of the things that I heard from Councilmember Golden was the issue about grants and the transportation certification. And I don't know how much of a heavy lift that is.
I'll give you the whole background. We did 2 years on periodic update of the comprehensive plan with a consultant that included a sub-consultant, Fair and Pierce, for transportation for the element. At that period, for about 3 or 4 months, we were asking for information from the Public Works Director. We didn't get it. So the consultant was tasked with, well, let's do the next best, which is create an element that reflects the local need. Less about showing our exhibits and what would satisfy certification at PSRC. So that's the cause. When we adopted our comprehensive plan, is it adequate? Absolutely, for growth management act, but we get conditionally certified at PSRC with 4 comments. Please resolve these. Give us a resolution that you promise to do this, what you're going to do, and then go do them, and then we'll fully certify you. That came and passed. We could restart that, but those 4 tasks are known and Fair and Pierce can do them. The problem was when we first asked this to get fully certified, when we were conditionally certified, it cost $53,000 and we didn't have it. So it becomes a resource issue. But the effort is known. If that's satisfied, they have no more comments. We're still tasked with becoming conditionally satisfied again. Then the city council adopts a work plan and a resolution. Then we do those 4 tasks to their satisfaction. And then we become fully certified. And then at the various levels of their grant funding, they funnel federal transportation grant money to the region. Is the simple way to put it. So whether it's sidewalks or streets or any program, we have to be certified for that. It's achievable.
Mark, just a quick follow-up on that. Like, what would you view as the level of effort from this group to kind of support that effort?
If we approach it in the near term, your institutional memory is all you would need. You know, you've put the transportation element in place and volume 2 background. And so it would be a task of letting them achieve that, showing you what it is, showing you why it matters to them, and seeing if you buy off on a comprehensive plan amendment. If we waited several years, then you have to refresh on what did we put in place. So pretty easy lift for you, but that's where the consultant comes in. They do that every day.
Maddie, do you have thoughts on our joint meeting and kind of
Oh,
out of-
always. How much time can I have? I mean, look, like our council, much like anybody on the planet, has more work to do than they have time to do it in. I remain disappointed that there isn't more. I mean, Councilmember Goldman was the only one who said, Tracy teed them up, and they all went towards this sort of economic development, which I still find is not something that we're like hearing the community clamoring for rezoning in the community. I was bummed that Larry was the only one who said, like, yes, let's work on housing. And I think that's important. So I still think that, to Yanni's point, I mean, we did say, hey, look, let's do the minimum of what the law requires, because we all have a passion for figuring out how to incentivize something other than 3-story townhomes that sell for $800 to $1.2 million a pop. And I think that still sits out there. And I would just remind you that we are an independent body, and I don't want to thumb my nose at the council by any stretch. But I think we all agree that housing is the issue based on what Olympia is doing. And we have some real opportunities if and when we get busy doing community outreach and surveys and trying to understand whether people want, a little brew pub in their neighbor's, backyard patio. Like, I think we miss out on the opportunity to ensure that we're making the progress we've all said we care about on housing. So I guess I would just say I hope that our shared passion around making good on the middle housing piece will allow us to prioritize that work, even despite the wish list that we heard from council. I think we would be remiss of our duties to not. I'm not sure everybody understands like what our laws changed in our city, and we know exactly what we're going to get, which would absolutely not move the needle. And since it's a little bit of a rant now, like, what happened to safe streets? We have the Climate Action Planning Group that is just wanting us to make progress on making sure people have safe, accessible options to not be in their car. And we have a whole entire planning document that says, hey, look, here's what we need across our community to make it safer for non-vehicular movement. And I didn't hear one council member say, we really need to, keep making progress on this really well vetted community document that articulates a chronic need that people say, which is we want to be able to walk in our neighborhood without being hit by a car. That's what I have to say. Hopefully that wasn't too ranty.
Thank you, Maddie. Cherie, do you want to go next and share your thoughts?
I don't know. I'm good. I agree with Maddie that we need to focus on the housing.
All right, and I think just to share, I don't know what's going on with this squeak. All right. I think coming out of it, oh my gosh. I don't know if you're hearing it, Maddie, but we're just having a loud squeak in the room.
No, it sounds perfect on my side.
Perfect. Well, we'll assume you're the only audience member then. I think coming out of it, like I was curious about the number of council members who did focus on kind of neighborhood businesses and neighborhood serving businesses. And I recall that like when we did the community survey for the comp plan update, I recall observing that that was a theme of community member feedback. I mean, there were other things to focus on, but that one really struck with me. And my bias of it that I said at the time was, I remember when we had Skog House with the little coffee house that was in the local 104 parking lot, and they were trying desperately to find a location to open in the community, and they couldn't, even though that was just the right size neighborhood serving business that, you know, they could have done on a lot or something and have been there, and there just wasn't anything available. And Heather, the owner, came to city council. She came to one of our meetings, I believe. She like met with people, and they're in Mount Lake Terrace now in a new development. But I continue to have interest in that, and I know it kind of plays to the issue as well that we've talked about in the past, and we always talk about with the fact that there's not enough tax revenue in the city, and that's one of the things that drives tax revenue is commercial, because we don't get much from the residential. We've heard that from our council liaison many times in the past. So I was curious about that, but I think in terms of priorities, how I would be inclined to proceed is we would prioritize doing the transportation element cleanup thing to be eligible for grants. We heard from one council member that that was important to be kind of situated for that. Sounds like a low level of effort that we would do without kind of needing a ton of like our bandwidth to do. I think I would be inclined to next prioritize affordability and some of the work that we've talked about on affordability. Then I would tee up for the council a decision on, do you want us to do these cleanup elements on critical areas and then waterfront afterwards? Or if I'm interpreting the mayor correctly, we focus less on that and focus more on future visioning, and then swap that out for, let's focus on either neighborhood serving retail and or kind of safe streets and safe transit paths. I think for the next year, that's going to be enough to fill our bandwidth, even if we take on extra meetings. But I would tee it up for the council for a decision, as we had planned to do, for giving them a proposed work plan. We give them the proposed work plan. We have a couple of decision points. I think on affordable housing, I would maybe have us spend a little bit of time now and clarify one or two key questions we want them to give us a steer on. We had a little bit of discussion on that. Do we mean capital A or lowercase a? We can kind of frame up, this is what we had been thinking, but do you want us to go a different direction? I do think one of the biggest challenges we have on affordable housing is just the scope of what we're talking about. You know, is it code amendments? Do we have the code review to look for where there are barriers? We've identified a few, but we've also heard from Mark that doing a comprehensive code review to look for all of the barriers is something that's going to require outside expertise. So if that's something they want us to focus on and we're going to go that way, are we going to get a consultant to help us on that? Or are there extra resources to help us on that? Do we want to continue to take up meeting time by having some organizations come and meet with us? We've talked about that last year. We had some questions teed up. Is that still a direction we want to go? That was kind of fact finding to figure out where to clarify where to go. So in summary, I think I would focus on those issues. I would tee it up for the council. I'd ask them for a more formal steer. And then I think it needs to be informed by our next topic, which is meeting frequency and how do we want to handle that.
Just to, I'm sorry, Maddie, but just a clarification question. My understanding is as a commission, we have decided that we are addressing affordability versus or affordability / diversity housing. That sounds like that. My understanding is we've already decided that we will pursue that in 2026. Is that everyone's understanding? Okay, So that's pretty much decided, right? Now what we need to decide is what are we doing to fill our time moving forward?
Sorry, was that a question?
Yeah. Or conclusion, the way I heard it from staff's perspective is that the third leg of your 2026 work is now a focus. No, the third leg of your unfinished 2025 work is now a focus in 2026 as a commission.
Yes.
And that now it's under that umbrella, which items should we focus on? And that would be consistent with the items you just listed.
Can I make a recommendation?
Please.
I'm thinking, Sam, that maybe as a cover from our chair for a work plan, that by the time you account for us making good on the middle housing that we've talked at length about, and then take care of some of the mandatory, but not, to Mark's point, urgent things, I think that will take the better part of what we have in our year. But I think it would also be useful, and this is my perspective, it would be useful to follow up on something that so many council members talked about, and that is that economic piece. I remember that survey that we've talked about, and if you go back and look at that, it was pretty light, like it was kind of pie in the sky. It was sort of like the outreach we did for Town Center, which is like, what do you want to see on this private property owner's property, And we treated it like it was city property. But I think one of the things before Planning Commission would ever take up work on what would it look like to either rezone some areas of our city or provide ubiquitous, access for businesses across the community. Because if you look at Bothell, they had done that. And if you look at what kind of businesses are allowed, I just have a hunch that's not what the community at large wants to see. So we could be really restrictive and be like, you can have a coffee house from like 8 a.m. to, 4 p.m. or something, right? Like, I think we need a lot more community outreach, perhaps done by a consultant during a survey, showing them some different ways in which we could have more commercial activity in our city, what the pros and cons of those are, before commission would be asked to start coming up with code language that would potentially put into play just the work that I don't believe we have community. I don't think we have we don't have clear enough input from our community to make a move on that. And I would love to see council do some surveying of the community before we would take that on. And I just think that could be a nice response after tonight, that here's what we are going to focus on. And we did hear you on the economic piece, but commission would need this type of input and feedback from the community so we would know which direction to work on that kind of those kind of code recommendations.
So it seems like there's consensus that for reporting to the council, our first priority is going to be the continuation of the 2025 work plan, which is affordability. I guess I want to double click on that though and ask, is it clear to the commission what aspect of that we're focusing on? Are we focusing on just the narrow piece of, are there incentives that we ought to do to encourage the type of middle housing that we think is right formed with the community, which seems to be less a discussion about capital A affordability and more of a discussion around lowercase a affordability? Is that where the consensus is? Because I guess I didn't quite realize that we had settled on that.
I don't think we have a lot of levers to pull for big A. I don't know how we would work on big A because it needs the private community. It needs partnership.
Yeah, I think one of the things though that we just heard from some of our guest speakers, and something I've been curious about a while, is are there barriers in code that would prevent a community land trust model from purchasing property here and then having extra incentives to have mixes between like capital A affordable and lowercase a affordable on the parcel? And there probably are code barriers to that. And one of them is what we just done in the city council code amendments, which are only allowing a duplex or a duplex and a detached ADU. That's all you can have. So is that a direction that we would be bringing in scope, or would we be really focusing more on the lowercase a? Because I think we owe it to the council to let them know what aspect of affordability are we going to be focused on.
Yes,
I'm sorry, and I'm just going to say that's the conversation that we started the last time. It's like, yes, we're going to continue the work on affordability, but what's the goal within that?
I guess what I wanted to say there is, I do feel like we have consistently said we think there's something here on the, small scale, whether it's cottage or other. And I think that doesn't exclude the idea of thinking about, really the community land trust is partially also kind of an ownership model around that. Right now, it doesn't matter who owns it. We can't do it. Nobody can build a cottage development here because our code doesn't do that. Right. So I think that's step one is, and I think there's a lot of interest in that. I even heard it from some of the council members that, hey, let's dig into that. So, and I think that's consistent with what we've been talking about. I really appreciated having the land trust people here. And I thought it was really interesting that they talked about kind of similar types of developments and this blended model. I thought that was super interesting. I think our first job, though, is to make it so that whether it's market rate or land trust, like being able to get that housing form that we've talked about, which currently is not going to happen with our code, even though we've said cottage housing is okay in our recommendations on housing, except that we're only allowing 2 units per lot, which means nobody's going to build cottages, right? So I don't know. I think that's a pretty clear set of marching orders, and it doesn't exclude that hybrid of taking small scale housing and then exploring community land trust engagement in that. I think that's fantastic. I think to Maddie's point, I kind of agree that we don't have a lot to work with for, like, let's just say, big traditional kind of affordable, apartment type settings that most big A affordable housing is of that kind. And I'm not saying I don't care about it. I'm just saying we don't have as many levers as such a small city with limited footprint for that type of development. I'm not sure that would be really productive for us. I think we could focus on the little A stuff. And if it leads to some cool stuff that also addresses big A affordability, that's awesome. And I know I saw you too, John, so I hope I didn't cut you off. We're all grabbing the mic.
Not at all. I agree completely. And I would just like to say again, I think that the home sharing approach is worth investigating because it can get a little bit to the big A issue without the resource implications. So in other words, if we can provide rent for $800 a month in our city, we've addressed some big A capability. I mean, whether it's formally recognized as such, I'm not sure. But, I think there are mutual benefits for the homeowner too. So I think that is something that I would advocate looking at in partnership with the land trusts and cottages and so forth.
Can I ask a question really quick? John, can you refresh our memory? What is the difference between what you're championing and me, like renting a room? If I had 2 empty rooms in my house, what currently stops me from renting those rooms in our code?
I don't think anything stops you. In fact, my neighbor across the street is renting rooms in her house. She's from Europe, and that's pretty common. She's an
Typical, yeah.
older person and is renting to older people. But the issue, I think, is that, and where the city can get involved, and there are other cities in Washington that have gotten involved, is that the homeowner, especially a vulnerable homeowner, needs some kind of hand-holding in the process. And some of these organizations provide that kind of glue that makes it feasible for the homeowner to get involved in those kinds of arrangements. I know that, for example, there's a site roommate.com. There are Lake Forest Park residents that are renting rooms on roommate.com. But what I'm talking about is something that is really more tailored for usually older people who are more vulnerable, maybe less technically able and so forth, and provides some actual guidance and support for the process.
John, there was a company that you mentioned that only works with the city, right? The city had to
Yeah.
hire them?
Well, Bellingham is using a company called Nesterly.
Yes.
And
I apologize for interrupting, but we have 10 minutes remaining of our meeting, right? And I think this is a good conversation within the affordability to have moving forward. But I still think that we've got to get back to what are we putting in our plan so that we can take it to the city council and have them give us their feedback.
So from the discussion, it sounds like affordable housing continuing from 2025 with a focus on lowercase a with optionality for capital A if there's opportunities to do that, inclusive of kind of home sharing, inclusive of potentially land trust, inclusive of some exploration about other models that are right-sized for our community. For the next item, would we put in the transportation element changes to be grant eligible? Was there objection to that or?
Sounds good.
And then for the third item go on, David.
Oh, no, please go ahead. Yeah.
For the third item, then are we left with doing what we talked about last month, which is doing the critical areas update and shoreline master plan next year? And then is there consensus to Maddie's recommendation that we ask council for them to lead an effort to do some community survey around neighborhood surveying retail? I mean, that is certainly something we could do. We could make that part of the work plan and we could ask for money and a consultant to do that. But it sounds like maybe there's consensus that we ask the council to do that.
I do like the idea of asking council to explore that and then they can bring it back to us. Not exactly as Maddie was saying, we heard you, we know, but please do your own work on that, bring it back to us if they're so inclined.
And I would use the word community outreach. We'd love to follow up on this perhaps in our next calendar year, but would benefit from more community outreach to better understand what is desired and which mechanisms and so on.
Was there anything that people felt we had to also add to the work plan before we start to discuss meeting frequency?
I don't think we can do more than that, but I'm thinking about what Cherie said about, timing. I think that feels like a lot already. So I would be a vote for I think that's enough.
The work plan. All right, well, let's move on to meeting frequency. I think we started discussion on this. We had some discussion at the joint meeting. Do people have a strong preference coming out of that if we move to twice a month versus once a month and then an off month working group versus keeping it as is? I think I'm probably not a vote for a twice a month. I'm open to a once a month and a once a month kind of working group or committee around some of this stuff where it makes sense. Or I'm open to keeping it the same, but I think we'd have to be open to kind of ad hoc meetings if needed.
Can we just go around each one?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Let's go to John next.
I like the idea of the working group, and I'm probably the wrong one to ask because I'm willing to put in a lot of more time, but then I'm retired. I don't have the commitments that some of you have. So, but I think that it's probably feasible to have multiple work groups, maybe concurrent work groups. And the only issue I have is with you, Mark. I mean, to what extent does the staff have to be involved in these work groups? I mean, if so, then that's going to be a limiting factor.
The idea is none at all other than to be aware.
Okay.
So if you avoid a quorum and open public meetings violations and so forth, it's a small subcommittee. All the work is actually done in a regular meeting. And if you adhere to that, I, just like any commissioner, I just need to be aware, get you materials, facilitate. But I don't imagine I'm part of each and every meeting and task.
Maddie would love your thought.
Would you? I'm thinking that I'm ready to dive in and for us to move in a really disciplined way on like a single issue. I think cottage housing would be a good thing to cut our teeth on. I think there's some good exemplars out in the community. And I think we could do some concurrent working groups where pairs of us were working together to study like, hey, you look at what Kirkland's doing or, Bellingham or wherever these places are, and then we can bring it back together. We'll all be immersed in it. We'll all be coming with examples to the table, which I think would make for a more fruitful joint discussion. So I'd just like to propose that we pair off and we each go do some research on model cottage housing as a starting place.
David?
The subgroup model is what I'm thinking, yeah.
Yanni?
I'm definitely open to that. As I've said, I just feel like in some way we need to increase our capacity to get stuff done. And I'm absolutely open to trying out subgroups and committees and keeping our regular meetings at once a month. So I appreciate that people are willing to lean into that type of model. I'd certainly be willing to work on, whether we divide up, with a couple of us are working on, say, diving into cottage housing and a couple of others are working some other issue, or if we do, as Maddie suggested, maybe we all kind of, divide and conquer on a key topic like cottage or other, housing of that kind. I'm open to either one. I don't have a clear picture of what that looks like. But I appreciate that people are willing to, just put in a little more time. And obviously, you're not obligated to be on a subgroup, and I mean, I hear you and I understand that it's a lot to ask. And I feel like our community needs us to do quite a bit. So, I'm totally happy with, testing that model out and then see at the end of the year, let's see if that worked or did we get enough out of it or what. So
I've already mentioned I have a lot of other stuff going on, and so stretched pretty thin as far as meetings go. So I'm happy to look at maybe minutes, when you guys get together for the subgroup, if you can send out an email, I'd be happy to look that over and brush up on that before the meeting.
But it sounds like there's general consensus that we will move to a subgroup model in the off weeks, voluntary for the people who want to do it, and we'll try to keep it sub kind of quorum level to avoid open public meeting act requirements that also, I think, allow for the meetings to be a little more efficient if they're smaller and ad hoc. Maybe we could come together at our next meeting and really have that as an agenda topic, Mark, to talk about where we ought to break off some of these subgroups. I like Maddie's idea of maybe having one to look at cottage housing, but maybe we could come, with a couple of issues around where it might make sense and then decide as a group of what are those subgroups and how do we do those meeting frequencies. Because, if David and I were on a subgroup, maybe we're going to meet on a Wednesday instead, we'll just kind of do it around our schedule. We'll have more flexibility that way. So I think we have a recommendation then for the proposed work plan. We'll send that to council. We'll come together next month and we'll talk about this. Are there other topics on old business before we move on?
I've got one more thing I'd like to say about subgroups. There we go. And it would be helpful if the commission was fully staffed or fully, that the vacant positions were taken, because I think with the subgroup approach, you need more people to participate in subgroups. especially if some people are unable to. So I think that if there's any way for us to advocate for recruiting or whatever, that it would be helpful for us to have the commission fully staffed.
All right. And
One final question about the work plan. Have we decided what are the percentages for each of these areas?
No, what staff would offer is I would circulate a draft for February 10th. That is in this format, but that we would fill it out and hopefully then move it to council for consideration. If this format works with 4 items, I could circulate that for thoughts on wordsmithing. That would then go into the packet. I have the concept, I know the items, I'll create that draft. What I would need is just help on capturing the exact wording that you know, large A, small A. And then truth test it with the whole commission February 10th and then bring that to council. Okay.
all right, new business. Anything new?
There is not at this time.
Reports and announcements?
Nothing to add. No.
Additional public comment? All right, agenda for next meeting. So the next meeting for February 10th, we're going to talk about the working groups. We're going to talk about the work plan. Mark, did you say, I forgot on sequencing, is this going to go to council before we meet then? We'll get an early steer from council on the work plan?
No, originally in December, staff received an email, prepare work plans for all the committees, commissions for January. Then the holidays came and here we are. And so tree board wants one more shot on February 4th for theirs. Parks board, I think, is ready to bring theirs forward. But based on the request for this joint meeting, the understanding now is if we bring the work plan to council in February and still do work, that we're right on track.
Sounds good. If you let us know maybe when that meeting is going to be, if you want somebody of us to come.
Definitely, and I know the date right now. Now, by code, we won't be in danger until March. Ideally, we have this January 1st, but we know these issues, so we're not late. The work plan, the item at council at the second meeting in February is a verbal reporting of last year and presenting of the work plan and then seeking feedback. That is February 26th.
Is there anybody from this group that wants to attend that? I'll be out of country, but.
I have a conflict on the 26th. I can attend.
I could potentially, what time is it? 7?
7 p.m.
Yeah, yes, I could do that. 26, you say?
Likely, yes.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to follow up with me by email, I'll put it on my calendar right now, but I'm actually in town and not busy.
So I think Maddie and David, if you both wanted to go, I mean, we haven't been invited, but it might just be good to be in the room and hear the discussion, and then you could share back with us if there's any kind of key takeaways on the work plan. I think that would be great. Awesome. And then, is there anything else? I'm going to entertain a motion to adjourn.
To adjourn.
There's been a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Hi.
We are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie. Take care.
You too.